We tend to think of novels simply appearing as books, but this sort of serialization means that thousands of readers had already encountered Paul Bäumer's story week by week, sort of in their daily newspapers. And by the time that the book was then published, there was already an enormous public interest.
Hi, Steffi. Thank you very much for joining me today for our podcast episode on Im Westen, nichts, Neues, for which we want to talk about the novel's journey from bestseller to book burning.
Yes.
But before we get to that, just to get us going, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where are you from? What brought you to Oxford? And maybe also, how did you become interested in German literature?
Yes, of course. So my name is Stefanie Hundehege. I was born in Münster and I studied at the University of Osnabrück, which, so very much in keeping with our podcast, is also Remarque's hometown. So I've been based in Oxford since 2024. I also work in London. I guess I was always drawn to the humanities and languages. I studied German and English, but I was also very interested in history. And I think that this interest has really shaped the way that I approach literature. So I'm interested in novels, poems and dramas, not only as works of art, but also as a way of understanding the societies and historical moments in which they were written. I think literature does not simply reflect history, it participates in it, responds to it, and sometimes even shapes it. So shapes the way later generations remember it, and that's always been a perspective that fascinated me.
So how has that interest in literature and history influenced your own research?
So my research mainly focuses on 20th century German literature, and part of my PhD a little while ago explored the wide spectrum of war writing produced during the interwar period and the different ways authors interpreted the experience and memory of the First World War. And since then, I've continued to work on the relationship between war and literature, albeit in a slightly different capacity. So I'm a literary provenance researcher, which means I investigate the material history of books and libraries. So I'm interested in how book and book collections moved between Germany, Austria, and Britain during the 1930s and 40s particularly, and what those journeys can tell us about the people who owned these books. So many of the books I work on belong to people who fled Nazi persecution. So these books' histories open up much bigger stories about exile, displacement, and survival.
Oh, how fascinating. That sounds amazing. And yeah, Erich Maria Remarque was one of these displaced people. So let us turn to Im Westen, nichts, Neues. How can a novel written by a German veteran become one of the most successful German books ever written, only to become, within a few months, one of the most hated books in Germany?
Yeah. So one of the most striking things about Remarque's career is that he didn't become famous immediately after the war. So after returning from the front, he worked as a teacher, as a journalist and editor, before turning to fiction. So Im Westen, nichts, Neues wasn't published until the end of 1928, so almost 10 years after the war had ended. And this timing matters because Remarque wasn't writing his novel into a vacuum. So by the late 1920s, the First World War had become one of the defining subjects of German literature and public debate. The war was not simply a historical event, it was the defining experience of a generation. And writers essentially spend much of the entire decade trying to make sense of what it meant. And even before 1914, writers had anticipated the war, sometimes quite enthusiastically, in poetry and prose and on stage. But once the war became a reality, that enthusiasm very quickly gave way to disillusionment. So we have examples of young writers such as Ernst Stadler and Alfred Lichtenstein, who were killed on the battlefield, while Georg Trakl, for instance, took his own life after suffering severe psychological trauma connected to his wartime experience. And at the time, there was little understanding of psychological trauma. Doctors were far better equipped to treat physical wounds than what we would now recognize as the invisible wounds of war. And many soldiers received little sympathy or effective treatment. And for those writers who did survive, the experience of the war didn't end with the armistice. It became an inescapable point of reference, and much of the 1920s can be read as an attempt to come to terms with what they had lived through. So They tried to find different ways to approach this from a narrative point of view. Some described the mutilated veterans, the shattered bodies, the psychological traumas. Others tried to find meaning in sort of values such as the sacrifice, comradeship. One of the most influential voices on this side of the spectrum was Ernst Jünger, whose novel In Stahlgewittern describes the dangers and the intensity of frontline combat. So Jünger published his novel originally in 1920, so very soon after the war ended, but he then repeatedly revised the text in newly published editions during the 1920s as he continued to rethink the experience of the war and how it could be narrated. And so by the late 1920s, these competing interpretations had become deeply political. So between 1914 and 1933, at least 10%, that's huge, 10% of all books published in Germany dealt with wartime experience. So new war novels appeared constantly, each offering sort of different interpretations of Germany's defeat, the meaning of sacrifice, the nation's future. So war literature at this point had become much more than a literary genre. It was a struggle over collective memory, over national identity, and also political legitimacy. And it was sort of into this already quite crowded and highly charged debate that Remarque published Im Westen, nichts, Neues. So people sometimes assume that the novel is sort of an immediate emotional response to the war, but in fact it appeared after nearly a decade of reflection. So the novel appeared as a serial in the Vossische Zeitung at the end of 1928. So Vossische Zeitung, one of Germany's leading newspapers, before being published as a book in January 1929. So we tend to think of novels simply appearing as books, but this sort of serialization means that thousands of readers had already encountered Paul Bäumer's story week by week, sort of in their daily newspapers. And by the time that the book was then published, there was already an enormous public interest. And the success really was extraordinary. Within little more than a year, Im Westen, nichts, Neues had sold around 1 million copies, which was vastly exceeding even Ernst Jünger's very impressive sales figures. But what made the novel so powerful was that Remarque presented modern warfare not as a source of national renewal or gave it heroic meaning or sort of as a source of political awakening, but simply as an experience of destruction, of loss, and alienation. Sort of his soldiers are not growing as individuals throughout the novel. They simply become part of a military machine that treats them as expendables, as a mass to be deployed and sacrificed according to purely strategic calculations. And I think it's because the novel reached such an enormous audience, it was no longer simply one interpretation among many. It threatened to become the dominant narrative of the war.
Yeah, and the debate surrounding Im Westen, nichts, Neues was not simply a literary dispute, it was a very politically charged issue, actually. Why did the question of what the war had meant become so central to German political culture at the time?
Yes, that's a very good question. Critics rarely focused on Remarque's style or in his sort of narrative structure, his artistic achievement. Instead, they argued about something much larger, which is what the war had meant and who possessed the authority to interpret it. So in Weimar Germany, wartime experience functioned as a form of political capital. So the authority to speak about Germany's future was often linked to participation in the war itself. So veterans were not simply former soldiers, they were treated as witnesses to a defining national experience. And the question of what the war had meant became so politically charged because Germany's defeat itself remained for many years deeply contested. So many Germans struggled to reconcile military collapse and the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Germany had lost territories, its colonies, it was forced to accept the sole responsibility for the war. It was forced to pay enormous reparations and was subjected to military restrictions. And for many people, these conditions appeared not simply punitive, but humiliating. And I think it's one of the strongest emotions that we can feel. So during the war itself, propaganda had increasingly fused personal honor with national honor. So to fight bravely was not merely an individual virtue, it was seen as defending the honor of the nation. So as a result, defeat could then be experienced as both a national and a personal humiliation. So different political movements offered different explanations for the defeat and different promises about how Germany should or could move forward. And no political movement really understood this better than the National Socialists. So the First World War occupied a central place in Nazi rhetoric. So Hitler, who had served throughout almost the entire war and had been awarded the Iron Cross, repeatedly presented his own political awakening as a product of his wartime service. So throughout his speeches during the campaigns in the 1920s and in the early 1930s, Hitler returned again and again to the themes of war, defeat, national humiliation. And this was usually the starting point of his speeches. And of course, very central to this narrative was also the so-called stab in the back myth. So the claim that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, but had been betrayed by politicians, by socialists and other supposed sort of internal enemies. And Hitler's skill as a propagandist was to weaponize precisely these feelings of humiliation, of betrayal and wounded honor, and transform them into political mobilization. So National Socialism presented itself as the movement that would restore Germany's honor, overturn Versailles, and fulfill the sacrifice of the fallen. And in this way, the memory of the war became a very powerful political resource.
Yes, it's a very charged environment that the novel gets published in. So yeah, when it does finally appear, maybe even as a book in 1929, how did readers react to the book?
So many readers welcomed Im Westen, nichts, Neues as a genuine account of the war, and publishers and reviewers at the time presented it as an authentic testimony written by an ordinary soldier rather than a literary intellectual. So authenticity mattered in two different ways. First, readers wanted to believe that the events described in the novels were grounded in real experience. So it mattered that Remarque had actually served in the war. But authenticity was also connected to the idea of the quote-unquote ordinary soldier. So the novel was presented as the account of someone without extensive literary training, someone simply describing what he had seen rather than poetically embellishing events or shaping them to fit a political agenda. And this image was central to the way that the book was marketed. So early advertisements stressed that Remarque was not a professional writer, but an ordinary veteran sort of recounting his experiences, which was only partly true. So while Im Westen, nichts, Neues was his first published novel, Remarque had previously worked as a journalist and editor and had published shorter pieces in newspapers and magazines. So nevertheless, the marketing focused on the idea that this was not literature in the traditional sense, but a direct and honest account of the war. And this strategy worked. So within a little more than a year, it sold around 1 million copies, and translations quickly appeared across Europe. And beyond, speaking of the translations, one example I do find particularly interesting is the English translation by a young Australian named Arthur Ween. It was published in London in 1929, so very shortly after the original was published. And Ween had served with the Australian forces during the war before studying at Oxford, and he was later working at the Victoria and Albert Museum. So his translation itself was a remarkable success. The English and American edition sold more than 500,000 copies within a few months. What I find so interesting is the way Ween was presented to readers. So rather than emphasizing his German language skills, the publishers stressed his experience as a frontline soldier. So Ween himself claimed that he understood Remarque's novel less by reason of his knowledge of German. That's how he expressed it. So he admitted his German was imperfect. And he said he understood the novel because he had shared the experiences it described. So because he had lived through the trenches and the mud and, you know, the noises, the sights, the smells of battle, because he had witnessed the suffering of the wounded and dying soldiers, he claimed he instinctively knew how these experiences should be rendered in English. Whether we should take that entirely at face value is another question. So I think translating a literary novel requires a very high degree of linguistic skill, and the details of how Wien acquired his German remains somewhat unclear, perhaps deliberately so. But what interests me is not whether the claim was true, but why it was so persuasive. So again, the wartime experience was presented as the ultimate source of authenticity, and academic training or intellectual skill is presented as secondary. So just as Remarque's authority rested on having fought in the war, Wien's authority as a translator rested on the claim that he too had been there. And yeah, I mentioned Wien because his translation, I think, highlights this broader pattern, and it shows that this emphasis on authenticity was not confined to Germany.
Oh, that's very, very interesting. But yes, when we think about this authenticity and what that means as for the interpretation of the war, not everyone accepted Remarque's interpretation of the war. Why did the novel provoke such a, almost fierce backlash?
Yeah. Well, I think it was partly the novel's extraordinary success. It was precisely what made it so controversial. So the more readers embraced Remarque's interpretation of the war, the more urgently his opponents felt the need to challenge it. And by April 1930, so less than a year and a half after the novel's publication, Hollywood had already produced a film adaptation, which was directed by Louis Milestone. So the speed with which the film was produced just shows how successful and influential the novel had become. Sort of when it reached German cinemas later that year, it brought Remarque's interpretation of the war to an even wider audience. Mm-hmm. And then the reception of both the book and the film was deeply divided along political lines. And the controversy was not limited to newspaper reviews. Sort of opponents were so outraged that they published entire books, I mean, albeit, very short ones, attacking, like this was just dedicated to attacking Im Westen, nichts, Neues, and some of these went through several editions again. So what is striking is that the debate there rarely centered on literary quality. So they were not publishing books on the literary quality of Im Westen, nichts, Neues, but they argued about whether he had represented the war truthfully. Mm-hmm. So for nationalist critics, Remarque increasingly became the opposite of Ernst Jünger. Mm. They were often pitted sort of against each other. Both men were veterans and both wrote about the war, but they represented fundamentally different responses to it. So Jünger acknowledged the horrors of warfare, but his writing nevertheless found meaning in values like courage, endurance, and comradeship. And Remarque, by contrast, presented the war as an experience of suffering, of loss, of alienation. His soldiers do not discover a higher purpose through combat. Instead, they become increasingly detached from both civilian society and the violence surrounding them. And so the sense was, well, how can both things be true? So because authenticity mattered so much, many critics tried to undermine Remarque's authority as a witness. So they downplayed his wartime experiences, and he had argued that he had not fought for nearly as long as the novel might suggest, or his biography would suggest. And he claimed that his rank, his decorations, and so including the Iron Cross, he had been misrepresented, that his injuries had not been as severe as he suggested, and also that he had spent sort of unnecessarily long time away from active service. So some nationalist commentators even argued that people like Remarque were partly responsible for Germany's defeats. The logic was that if the war had been lost because too many soldiers lacked faith in the cause. So if more soldiers had shared Jünger's determination and belief in the struggle, this is the idea, the outcome might have been different. So the novel's international success itself became a target. So critics argued that sales on such scale that could not have happened naturally, and it must have been driven by powerful interests and that wanted to promote a particular interpretation of the war. And this gave rise to conspiracy theories about international groups supposedly shaping public opinion and with it collective memory. So in National Socialist circles, particularly, criticism of the novel also turned into a personal attack with the goal of undermining Remarque. So Erich Maria Remarque, with the francophone spelling of the last name, was a pen name. And nationalist critics presented this as evidence of a supposedly Jewish origins. And the claims were false, but I think they show how quickly debates about the memory of the First World War became entangled with anti-Semitic rhetoric of the political right. So if Remarque himself could be portrayed as alien to the German nation, then his interpretation of the war could be dismissed as equally illegitimate. So by the early 1930s already, what had begun as a debate about a novel had become something much larger. It was a struggle about who had the authority to interpret the First World War and through that to shape Germany's understanding of its own past.
It's always fascinating to see how conspiracy theories are just everywhere and at all times. And yeah. So then the Nazis do get into power, and what happens, or what happened when the Nazis were no longer just arguing about the version of the war, but actually had the power to suppress it?
Yeah, so even before 1933, Remarque had become the target of increasingly aggressive political attacks. So the release of the Hollywood film adaptation in 1930, for instance, provided an opportunity for Joseph Goebbels, who was then emerging as the chief architect of Nazi propaganda, to turn a debate about war memory into a political campaign. So he organized SA members to disrupt screenings by protesting outside cinemas or even releasing smoke bombs inside them during screenings. And at the same time, the Nazi press campaigned relentlessly against the film, sort of presenting it as an insult to German soldiers and to the nation's honor. And this strategy proved remarkably successful. So within a month of the film's release in Germany, the authorities banned it on the grounds that the film was causing public disorder. And the irony was, of course, that much of this disorder had been deliberately orchestrated by Goebbels himself. So by creating the disturbance and then presenting it as evidence that the film was dangerous, he turned orchestrated disruption into a justification for censorship. The ban, then again, also provoked opposition. So writers and intellectuals on the political left, Karl von Ossietzky, Karl Zuckmayer, Heinrich Mann, Käthe Kollwitz, publicly and emphatically criticized this decision. And the pressure then contributed to the film's re-release in 1931, so first in restricted screenings for certain audiences, and then later there was a shortened version for wider audiences. But by this point, the political climate had become so hostile that Remarque decided to move to Switzerland in the summer of 1932, only months before Hitler became Chancellor. And after 1933, the struggle over the memory of the war ceased to be a public debate and became a matter of state policy. So the Nazi regime prohibited both the film and Remarque's writing. And in May 1933, Im Westen, nichts, Neues was then publicly burned by students and Nazi organizations across Germany. And the message was very clear. Certain interpretations of the war would no longer be tolerated. The attacks did not stop with the books. In 1938, the regime revoked Remarque's citizenship, effectively turning one of Germany's most internationally successful authors into an exile. And the following year, Remarque emigrated to the United States.
And it's also quite fascinating because he then actually led quite an interesting life after his emigration, quite a glamorous life. We don't have the scope to get into it, but if people are interested, they should definitely look it up. Yeah. It includes marrying an ex-wife of Charlie Chaplin, as a little spoiler. But yes, thank you so much for taking us through this journey of Im Westen, nichts, Neues from a bestseller to a burning book, essentially. I have one more question for you, Steffi, before we wrap up. I'd like to ask a broader question, which is also a very hard question that I asked every one of our guests so far. In your opinion, what makes Im Westen nichts Neues a German classic?
I think Im Westen nichts Neues is a German classic because I think it works on several different levels. So it's an extraordinary, powerful novel about the experience of modern warfare, but it is also a book that shaped the way generations of readers have understood the First World War. So few German novels have had such an immediate international, not only national, but international impact, or provoked such intense political debate. And I think the novel continues to speak to readers far beyond its original historical moment. And its own history has become part of its significance. It was not simply read, it was translated around the world, it was adapted for cinema, it was attacked by its opponents, it was banned and publicly banned by the Nazis. So the story of the novel, I think, reminds us that literature can matter politically because books don't just reflect history, they can shape how societies remember their past and imagine their future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Im Westen nichts Neues is really a prime example of this. Thank you very much, Steffi. I learned so much today about the legacy of the novel.
Thank you very much.